An old woman asked me to pretend I was her grandson, and by sunrise, men in Washington were running scared.
The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight when Hank Mercer pulled off Route 50 and into the gravel lot of Calhoun's diner. He did not pull off because he was hungry. He pulled off because the desert highway had gone the color of wet slate, and his headlight was cutting maybe 40 feet ahead, and that was not enough margin for a man who had already used up most of his luck. He killed the engine, sat there a moment with rain ticking against his jacket and the wind pushing across the lot in flat sheets that had come a long way across the high desert and lost none of their ambition. Then he went inside. The diner was the kind of place that had been the same since 1974 and intended to stay that way. Laminate countertop the color of old mustard, ceiling tiles with brown water stains arranged like a map of nowhere. A jukebox in the corner that someone had unplugged years ago and never bothered to move because the space it occupied had become more familiar than the silence removing it would leave. 4 booths along the window wall, each one cracked at the same seam in the vinyl, each one repaired with the same dark tape. A counter with 6 stools, 3 of them occupied by men who looked like they had arrived sometime in the previous decade and had not yet decided to leave. Hank took the last booth, the one farthest from the door and farthest from the window, with a clean sight line to the kitchen entrance and the parking lot both. Old habit, the kind that does not go away no matter how many years pass between the circumstances that created it. You do not unlearn the things that kept you alive. The waitress came without being called. She was somewhere in her 50s, red hair gone mostly gray at the roots, with the walk of a woman who had been on her feet since before Hank was born and had made her peace with it decades ago, without ceremony or complaint. Coffee, he said. She poured without writing anything down and left him alone with it. He wrapped both hands around the mug. Outside, the rain picked up. The gravel lot filled with moving water that had nowhere to go. A semi sat dark and idle at the far edge of the lot, its running lights orange and the black patient and enormous and indifferent to the weather. Hank watched it for a while the way a man watches things when he is not really watching anything at all, but needs somewhere to put his eyes. He had been in Nevada for 11 days. Before that, Utah for 2 weeks of roads he had not planned. Before that, a stretch of Wyoming that he could not entirely account for, days that had passed without particular content or destination. I was not running from anything specific. He had not been doing that for several years. What he was doing was harder to name. Moving, he supposed. Staying in motion because stillness had a way of letting certain things catch up with him, and he had long since learned to prefer the road. I was 47 years old. He had a Harley that needed a new rear tire and about $900 in cash and no particular place to be and no one waiting for him anywhere on the continent. Those facts described his situation accurately. He had stopped feeling any particular way about them. He drank his coffee. He did not look up when the door opened. He looked up at the sound of her shoes. They were wrong for the weather. Low heels, the kind a woman wears to church or a doctor's appointment or a funeral. Not rain shoes, not highway shoes, not what you put on when you are planning to be out in a Nevada desert in December. The sound of them on the diner floor was unsteady, not quite a shuffle and not quite a limp. The sound of someone moving carefully because moving was costing them something they could not fully afford, and they were spending it anyway. He looked up. She was 85 if she was a day. Maybe older. Small in the way that age makes people small, as though something essential had been slowly drawn out of her over the years, until what remained was concentrated down to something very spare and very precise. White hair. A coat that was good quality and soaked through and had the look of something slept in. Her hands were shaking, not trembling the way cold hands tremble, but a finer vibration deeper than the surface, the kind that starts in the chest and works its way outward. Her eyes were completely clear. That was what made Hank keep watching. The hands shook. The body was exhausted. But her eyes moved through that diner the way a surveyor moves through a field, taking inventory, assessing, calculating something he could not yet name. She was not afraid. She was working. She saw him. She came straight to his booth. I had time to notice one more thing before she reached him. The watch on her left wrist. Silver. Elegant. The kind of watch that costs more than most people spend on a car, the kind selected carefully and worn to occasions where it matters. It did not belong with the rest of her. The coat was soaked and rumpled and had been slept in at least once. The shoes were wrong for everything except the occasion she had originally dressed for before whatever had happened had happened. The bag she carried was a plain canvas tote, the kind you get free at a grocery store promotion. But the watch was the watch of a woman who had put it on several days ago for a reason that no longer existed and had not thought about it since. Someone who had packed that bag in a hurry. Someone who had grabbed her coat and her keys and run before she had time to think about what she was putting on her wrist. She stopped at the edge of his booth. She looked at him for one long moment. He could see her making the same kind of calculation he had just made about her, reading something in his face, deciding something about what she saw there. Then she said it. Please pretend to be my grandson. I don't have time to explain. Hank Mercer was not a man who startled easily. He had been in situations that would permanently rearrange most people's understanding of what a bad night looked like. He had been shot at in conditions where being shot at was not even the worst thing currently happening. He had been in rooms where the air was bad in ways that had nothing to do with ventilation and everything to do with the intentions of the people occupying them. He had sat across from men who wanted him dead and kept his face exactly as still as it needed to be. But something in the way she said those words, the absolute lack of theater in them, no pleading, no performance, just a quiet and devastating statement of need delivered in the tone of a woman who had already exhausted every other option and had arrived at this one as the last thing available. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he said loud enough for the counter in the neighboring booth to hear, "Grandma, I told you to stay in the car." Her shoulders dropped, not dramatically, not in the way of someone who has been rescued from something, in the way of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally, just for this moment, been permitted to set it down. She sat across from him. The vinyl seat creaked under her weight. There was almost nothing to her. He said nothing. He waited. The waitress appeared, looked at the old woman with the practiced assessment of someone who has seen most of what a diner sees over a long career, and without being asked, poured a second cup of coffee and set it down in front of her. Some people read a room without needing it explained. The woman wrapped her hands around the mug the way he had. He noticed that her knuckles were red, not scraped, but red in the way old skin gets in cold weather when it has been exposed long enough for the cold to settle in. She had been outside for some time before she found this diner, before she found him. He let the silence sit. Outside, the rain came down harder against the window. The jukebox in the corner stood dark and useless, and the ceiling fan moved in its slow, indifferent circle above the counter, and the men at the counter talked in low voices about something that had nothing to do with anything. She said her name was Rose. Rose Calloway. Her voice was even professional, almost the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years standing in front of first graders and teaching them to pay attention, and had never entirely put that voice away. She said her husband had been dead for 3 months. His name was Walter. Walter Calloway. He had worked for the Department of Defense for 42 years, Contracts Division. Auditing, the kind of work that sounds dull at every dinner party, and actually is dull at most of them, the work that happens in the background of larger things, and is necessary precisely because it is unremarkable. He had started in 1980 and he had ended in September of this year, when he died in his sleep on a Tuesday morning, and she had come downstairs and found him when he did not come down for coffee. The doctors said massive coronary failure, natural causes. He was 78 years old. It made sense to everyone. She paused here. She looked into her coffee. It made sense to everyone, she said. The words sat in the air between them with a weight that was not grief exactly, but was something heavier than ordinary loss. 2 days before he died, she told him Walter had come to her in the kitchen while she was washing the dinner dishes. He had stood in the doorway with a look on his face she had not seen since 1987, when their son was born, 6 weeks early, and they had not known for 3 days whether he was going to make it. That look, the one that means the world has just shifted under your feet and you are not sure yet which way you are falling or how far it goes. He said he had found something. She had asked him what. He said he needed to be careful about how much he told her. He said it was safer if she did not know the details yet. He said he was going to contact someone. He trusted someone in the right position to do something about it. He said he had an appointment in the morning with his oldest friend, a man he had known since law school in 1965. He said after that meeting, everything was going to change. Those were his exact words. Everything is going to change. She had not slept well that night or the next. On the third morning, Walter did not come down for coffee. Hank listened. He had not touched his coffee since she started talking. He listened the way he had been trained to listen, which is to say he listened not only to what she said, but to the space around what she said, the pauses and the specific word choices, and the things she almost said and decided against. After the funeral, she told him men came to the house. 3 of them, professional, polite in the particular way that expensive lawyers are polite, which is to say they were polite in a way that made clear they expected to get what they came for and considered it a foregone conclusion. They said they were from Walter's former employer. They said he had left behind certain files and records considered property of the department, and they were there to collect them for proper archival purposes. She had given them boxes, old tax returns, meeting notes from 2003, things that meant nothing and were meant to mean nothing. What they were looking for, she said she had already moved. She reached into the canvas bag and brought out an envelope. Plain, no markings of any kind on the outside. She placed it on the table between them. Hank looked at it, then he looked at her. She said Walter left strict instructions. He told me in a note tucked inside the front flap. He said, do not open the back of the last page. Not until you are with Emmett. I was very precise about that. He said Emmett Treadwell, his oldest friend, a man in Denver. He said the instructions about what he had hidden and who to trust would be there on that last page, and everything would make sense when I was sitting with Emmett. She said, I have been carrying this for 3 months, and I have not looked past the papers because Walter asked me not to. I have honored every instruction that man ever gave me for 55 years. I was not going to stop with this one. She said, I do not know what is behind that last page. I only know the summary, the names and the numbers and the contracts. He said, tell me what the summary shows. She said it was exactly that, a summary, names, company names, contract numbers, dollar amounts, routing numbers for bank accounts, enough to prove that a pattern existed. Her husband had spent 6 months building it quietly on his own, pulling on a thread he had found by accident when a contract came across his desk for renewal and something in the numbers had not added up. A company called Meridian Solutions, $3 million for software development and maintenance services. Everything looked correct on paper. The documentation was clean. The approvals were all in order. But Meridian Solutions did not exist. It had an address, a post office box in Delaware. It had a tax identification number. It had bank accounts, but no employees, no office, no product, no work of any kind had ever been done under its name. It was a name on paper connected to accounts that received money and then distributed it in smaller amounts through a chain of other names on paper, each one a layer of distance from the original payment. Walter had pulled the thread. Bunny had found more threads. Each one led somewhere it was not supposed to lead. $47 million, she said. That was what the summary showed, what he could verify in those pages. He believed the actual number went much further. Different agencies, different years, different shells, but the same architecture, underneath built by someone who understood exactly how each layer of institutional distance would function and had designed the structure to exploit that understanding precisely. And 3 names, she said, kept appearing throughout everything he found. Different contracts, different departments, different years, but the same 3 people who always present somewhere in the chain, always involved at the approval stage, always there when money moved. Hank said, who are they? She said she would tell him when they were not sitting in a diner with what she believed was a vehicle in the parking lot that had been following her since Lovelock, 40 miles east. He used the window's reflection to look at the lot without turning his head. 3 vehicles. His bike under a tarp at the far end, a pickup, dark, no movement visible inside. A black SUV near the entrance at a bad angle, not straight in the space parked the way a man parks when he wants a clear and immediate exit rather than just somewhere to leave his car. He said, how long has that been out there? She said she had first noticed what she believed was the same vehicle at the rest stop 40 miles back. He said, keep your eyes on me. We are 2 people finishing a conversation about family. You drove a long way and you are glad to see your grandson, even if he does not show it the way you would like. She settled back slightly in her seat, a very small adjustment. Suddenly, she looked entirely like what they needed her to look like. Then the door opened. The man who walked in was not from Fallon, Nevada. He was not from anywhere near Fallon, Nevada. His suit was dark gray and fit the way suits fit when someone has paid real money for the fitting and has worn enough of them to know exactly what they need. His shoes were clean despite the wet parking lot, which meant he had come from his vehicle directly to the door without pausing in the rain. His face was pleasant and confident, and he moved through that diner with the ease of a man who moves through every room as though he already has some claim on it. I was 56 maybe, silver at the temples, the kind of tan that comes from places with better weather than Nevada maintained consistently across many years. His eyes found Rose immediately. He walked to the booth. He looked at Rose with an expression of warm relief, the precisely calibrated expression of a man who has been genuinely worried and is no longer worried. Then he looked at Hank, and his expression shifted only slightly, a small professional recalibration of the situation in front of him. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, what a relief. We have all been so concerned." He looked at Hank. He said, "I apologize for the interruption. I am Clifton Graves, a very old family friend. And you are—" Rose spoke before Hank could answer. She said, "I don't have a son." Her voice was flat and clear and carried exactly as far as it needed to carry. The two men at the nearest section of counter turned their heads. The waitress midway through filling a cup at the other end of the counter paused with the pot held in the air. Clifton Graves looked at her. His smile did not disappear. It thinned to something else, something that was underneath the smile and had always been there. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, I think the last few months have been very hard on you. Grief does things to a person's perspective." She said, "Mr. Graves, I am 85 years old and I taught school for 30 years, and I have been confused perhaps 4 times in my life, and this is not one of them. I have a daughter in Phoenix and a son in Portland, and neither one of them is you, and I know the difference perfectly well." He looked at Hank. Hank had stood up while this exchange was happening, slowly, the way a man stands when he is in no hurry and has nowhere to be and is simply adjusting his position. He was 6 feet and change, and he had the build of someone who had been doing physical work for a long time, the kind of lean that comes from years outdoors without regular meals. The tattoos on both hands were visible, and the one on his neck was visible, and his eyes were the calm, specific gray of a man who has looked at worse things than Clifton Graves and decided what to do about them without requiring much time. He said she does not have a son. Graves looked at him for a moment. A quick and professional assessment, the kind of calculation a man makes when he encounters an obstacle he had not planned for and needs a few seconds to price it correctly. He said, "I understand. I apologize for the confusion." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card and set it on the table. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, if you change your mind, room 8 at the Sunset Motel, just down the road." Then he reached into his jacket again for a pen to write a second number on the card. He set the pen down on the table while he adjusted something in his inside pocket, his attention briefly on the contents of the jacket rather than the table surface in front of him. The pen sat on the table edge, silver, expensive. The kind of pen a man of Clifton Graves's type carries, the way other men carry reading glasses, always present, always within reach, a small statement about what kind of man he is. Hank picked it up. He turned it over in his hand the way a person turns over a pen when checking whether it clicks or has a cap or testing casually whether it has ink. He clicked it once. In that same motion, unhurried, his thumb pressed against the barrel near the clip at the seam where the metal clip met the body of the pen. He held his thumb there for 2 seconds. He set the pen back on the table closer to Graves' side and crossed his arms. What no one in that diner could have seen was the magnetic tracker strip, no larger than a grain of rice, that Hank had pressed into the seam in those 2 seconds. He had carried 3 of them in the inside pocket of his jacket for the better part of a year, a habit from an earlier period of his life when knowing where people and things were had mattered in very specific and urgent ways. He had not used one in months. He had not thought about using one until the moment Clifton Graves set that pen on the table, and Hank looked at the man behind the expensive suit and understood what kind of problem had just walked into the room and what it was going to take to manage it. Graves collected the pen and the card and buttoned his jacket with the smooth efficiency of a man who buttons jackets many times a day, and has stopped noticing that he does it. He nodded to Rose. He nodded to Hank. He walked back through the diner and out the door without hurrying, without looking back the way a man walks when he is certain the outcome is already settled. The diner exhaled. Hank sat down. Rose was watching him with the particular attention of a woman who has spent 85 years observing people and has never stopped getting better at it. She said, "What did you just do?" He said, "Something that may matter later. Tell me the three names from Walter's summary." She told him. Clifton Graves was one of three names that appeared throughout Walter's documentation. A consultant with established relationships across multiple defense agencies, always present at the approval stage of the contracts in question, always connected to the companies receiving payment. The other two were a deputy director at a procurement office whose signature appeared on approvals going back 9 years, and a federal contracts attorney who had structured the shell companies from the beginning and knew exactly how they were supposed to look on paper, the kind of people whose names appeared on the right documents and then retreated back into the comfortable obscurity of institutional middle distance, unremarkable on the surface, and protected by the very systems they were using. Hank listened to all of it. Then he looked at the parking lot. He said, "We need to leave. We move like people who are finishing up, not people who are running." She put the envelope back in the bag. She stood without being told. He left money on the table and they walked to the kitchen. The young man at the dishwasher looked up with the exhaustion of someone 30 minutes from the end of a shift, who wanted no new information from the world. Hank said, "Just passing through," and kept moving, and they pushed out the back door into the service alley. Cold, wet concrete, the smell of old grease and desert rain. He held the door and let it close behind them and stood still for 3 seconds and listened. Nothing behind them yet. He said, "Fast as you can." They moved through the alley around to the edge of the lot where his bike sat under the blue tarp. He had it uncovered in 8 seconds. She looked at it. He watched her look at it. 58 years old, chrome and black, built for distance and not much else. She said, "I have never been on one of those." He said, "You hold on and you lean when I lean. That is everything you need to know." She said, "All right." She climbed on. It took her a moment and she did not apologize for it. She settled in behind him and her arms came around his waist, and her grip was stronger than he expected. The grip of a person who has made a decision and is committing to it completely. He started the engine and swung out of the lot on the backside, away from the SUV, onto the access road, and then onto Route 50 heading east. In the mirror, he saw the diner recede. The yellow light of the window went small in the dark and rain. He also saw headlights pull out of the lot behind them. He opened the throttle. The rain was lighter now, more mist than rain, and the road unrolled ahead, gray and wet and empty. Empty. Rose's grip around his waist tightened when the speed increased. Not from panic, from the adjustment of a person learning how a new thing moves. She was reading the machine. He watched the mirror. The headlights behind them maintained a fixed distance. He slowed slightly. They slowed. He accelerated. They accelerated. Not coincidence. He took a right onto an unmarked dirt road without signaling. The bike fishtailed once in the mud, and he corrected without thinking and pushed on into the dark. The headlights behind them slowed at the turnoff, paused at the entrance to the dirt road, and did not follow. He rode another half mile and pulled off behind a low ridge of rock and killed the engine and the headlight. They sat in the complete dark. The rain ticked against the stone around them. The desert smelled like and wet clay, and the clean, empty cold that belongs to high Nevada in December. A coyote said something to the dark not far away and got nothing back. Rose said, "Are they gone?" He said, "For now, we have some time." She said, "Where are we going?" He said, "A town called Eureka, about 40 miles east. I know someone there who can get us a vehicle, something they will not recognize." She said, "Can you trust him?" I thought about Dex Crane, 9 years between them, the night in Reno when a weapons charge had needed one person to step forward and take it, and Hank had stepped forward because Dex had a daughter who was 3 years old at the time, and Hank did not have anyone in the world who would have suffered specifically from his absence. He had done 3 years and come out and never asked for anything in return and never mentioned it. He said, "He owes me. Right now, that is more reliable than trust." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the scrub around them with the low, persistent sound of something searching. She said, "Why are you helping me? You do not know me. You have no particular reason to believe what I have told you is true. He had been expecting the question. He had not expected to not have a clean answer for it. He said my father worked in defense supply, quality control at a contractor outside Dayton, Ohio. He found something once. A problem in the supply chain. Components being passed through on military equipment that had no business passing. He reported it to the people he was supposed to report it to. He stopped. She waited. He said they fired him. He filed every complaint there is to file. Nothing happened. He died in 2013. I was in Texas when it happened. I did not get home in time. He did not say the rest of it. The phone call 2 weeks before the end. The specific thing Dale Mercer had said in that call, the way Hank had listened to that instruction and followed it and had been living with the weight of that obedience ever since. Rose said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, I am sorry about your father. He said, I am not telling you for sympathy. I am telling you so you understand that I am not going to drive away. They sat in the dark 3 more minutes. No headlights appeared on the dirt road. The coyote tried one more time in the distance and went quiet. He started the engine. The ride to Eureka was 40 minutes through the kind of country that makes you understand why certain words exist. High desert, low scrub. The occasional cluster of lights from a ranch set so far back from the road, it looked like something you had imagined. The sky above had cleared in patches, and between the clouds, Hank could see stars the way you see them in the high desert wall to wall across the dark, more of them than the eye has any framework for. Rose kept her grip steady the whole 40 minutes. She had stopped being afraid of the speed somewhere in the first 10 miles. He could feel the difference in how she held on the shift from bracing against the machine to simply riding with it. He called Dex from a straight stretch phone to his ear, one hand on the bars. Dex answered on the second ring. His voice was the voice of a man who answers phones all hours because in his line of work, hours are a suggestion. Hank said, it is me. A pause. Then I heard you were somewhere in Utah. Hank said, I need a vehicle. Clean title. 4 doors. Nevada heading to Eureka. Another pause. This one was different from the first. Longer. There was something in it that Hank noted and filed carefully, the pause of a man who is thinking about more than logistics, who is making a calculation that involves more variables than the question being asked. He said Dex. Dex said, yeah, I know a guy there, Silas Boggs. Garage on the east side, I will call ahead. Hank said, appreciate it. Dex said, how long are you in Nevada? Hank said, just passing through. He did not say where he was going. He noticed that he did not say it, and he noticed the pause that had preceded Dex's answer, and he filed both things in the place where he kept things he would need to think about later. He hung up. They reached Eureka past 10. The town was the kind that goes quiet early and means it and always has. One bar still lit on the main street, a gas station, a laundromat with a single fluorescent light on inside. Silas Boggs's garage was on the east side past a white clapboard church and a farm supply store. 2 bays and a small office with a light in the window. Hank knocked. A man came to the door. 54 years old, big through the shoulders, gray work shirt with grease worked into the fabric in the patterns of a man who has been doing this work for 30 years and has long stopped trying to remove the evidence. He looked at Hank. He looked at Rose. He looked at the wet coat and the canvas bag and the wrong shoes. He said, Dex called. He said, get inside. The office was warm, a space heater in the corner running hard, a desk covered in invoices and parts orders. The smell of old coffee and motor oil and winter cold that had been let in too many times and never fully let out. Silas Boggs had a sedan, gray, 8 years old, high mileage, but he had rebuilt the engine himself last spring, and it would get them where they needed to get. He would have it ready by 6 in the morning. He named a price. Hank said yes. Silas looked at them both for a moment, then said, there were 2 men in here this afternoon asking if I knew a man named Mercer. I told them I did not know every trucker who came through this town. He paused. He said, I am telling you that so you know what you are walking into. Hank looked at him steadily. He said, thank you for that. Silas nodded and turned back to his workbench without making anything more of it. A man who had chosen his level of involvement and was satisfied with it. They walked to the motel, 4 blocks. Rose made all 4 without complaint, though by the 3rd block he could see by the set of her jaw that the shoes were costing her something she would not name because naming it would not change anything about it. He offered his arm after the third block, and she took it without making it into anything more than two people walking on a cold night. The motel was small and plain and warm inside. Hank paid for 2 rooms and they walked to their respective doors. Rose stopped with her hand on the handle and turned. She said, "Hank, there is something I need to tell you about the envelope." He said, "Tell me tomorrow. Sleep first." She said, "He told me, Walter. The night before he died, he came downstairs very late and I was reading in the front room. And he sat across from me and he said, 'Rose, if anything ever happens to me, there is something you are going to need to find.' He said he could not tell me where yet. He said he needed one more day to be sure it was in the right place and the right person would find it at the right time. He said he was meeting his oldest friend in the morning, and after that he would explain everything." She said he went to bed. She said he did not wake up. She looked at the canvas bag on her arm. She said, "Walter told me the instructions were at the back of the last page of the envelope. He was specific. He said everything I needed would be there and it would make sense when I was sitting with Emmett. I have done what he said. I have not looked past the papers, but I think what he actually hid may be somewhere I have not yet thought to look." Hank was quiet for a moment. He said, "We will look together in the morning." She nodded. She went inside. He went to his own room and sat in the chair by the door. He looked at the ceiling. He listened to the town settle. Small places go quiet differently from cities, differently from open country, something specific and in between. He sat with the quiet and turned over what he knew and what he suspected and what the shape of the next 12 hours needed to look like to have any chance of working. His phone rang at 1:47 in the morning. Unknown number. He answered. The voice on the other end was smooth in the way of a man who has spent years using his voice as a primary instrument and has refined it to something very precise, measured, unhurried, pleasant in a way that sat wrong against everything else, like something wearing the right clothing, but moving wrong inside it. The voice said, "Mr. Mercer, I hope I am not calling too late." Hank said nothing. The voice said, "My name is Clifton Graves. I believe we met briefly this evening. I want to apologize for any confusion at the diner. Mrs. Calloway has been going through an extraordinarily difficult time, and we have all been genuinely concerned." Hank said, "I do not know who you are talking about." The voice said, "I think you do, and I think you are a practical man, Mr. Mercer. I have been doing some reading on you this evening. Former Marine, 2 tours in Iraq, 2004 to 2006. Honorable service record. Some years afterward that were harder than they needed to be." Hank said nothing. He sat very still in the chair. The voice said, "I am in a position to offer $200,000, clean, untraceable, in exchange for a simple conversation about your current location." The voice said, "Mrs. Calloway is confused and frightened. She has been since her husband passed. What she believes she is carrying is not what she thinks it is. We simply want to help her and put this unfortunate situation to rest." Hank said, "I am going to say this once." He said, "Do not call this number again." The pleasantness in the voice thinned to something underneath it. The voice said, "I know who Dale Mercer was, Mr. Mercer. I know what happened to him in Dayton in 2011. I know about the complaint he filed and where that complaint went and what happened to it. I know all of it. And I think you should understand that what happened to him is not something that happens to people who make sensible choices when they have the opportunity." Hank hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the wall. The voice had said his father's name. Said it the way you hold up a card to show someone what you are holding. Not quite a threat, a demonstration, a proof of reach. A message that said, "We have been through your history and we know everything, including the things that are not in any public record, and we are not concerned about you." He set the phone on the nightstand. He found the number for Kara Drummond. He had carried it for 2 years. An investigative reporter at the Denver Courier who had broken 3 significant stories in 5 years. The kind of stories that cost powerful people sleep and money, and in 2 cases their positions. He had kept the number the way you keep certain numbers against the day when the reason arrives without warning. He called. She answered on the third ring, alert in a way that said she had not been asleep. She said, "This is Drummond." He said, "You do not know me. My name is Hank Mercer. I have a story." She said, "People with stories call during business hours." He said, "Not this one." 14 seconds of silence on her end. He let them pass. She said, talk. He talked. He told her enough. Defense contracting. Hundreds of millions of dollars across a dozen years. Names that would mean something to the right people. A woman who had been running for 4 days with documentation her husband died putting together. When he stopped, she was quiet. She said, how solid is the source? He said her husband spent 42 years as a federal auditor. He is dead. The people who had him killed have been following her across Nevada. A longer silence. She said, where are you? He said, Nevada tonight. Denver tomorrow if things go the way I need them to. She said, call me when you are an hour out. He said he would. He put the phone down. He looked at the dark window, the desert beyond it, the stars that had come fully out through a gap in the clouds, cold and numerous, and entirely indifferent to everything happening below them. I thought about his father. Dale Mercer at the kitchen table in Dayton in the winter of 2011, finding one number in one column that did not add up, deciding that he could not simply move to the next line, filing the paperwork, going through the channels, believing that the system built to handle exactly this would handle it. He had been wrong about the system. He had not been wrong about the instinct underneath the decision. About what a man is when you strip away everything else and look at what he does when he finds something wrong and could choose to look away. He lay down on the bed without taking off his jacket. He did not sleep. He kept his eyes on the ceiling and worked through the shape of what would need to happen and waited for 5:15. At 5:40 in the morning, in the gray pre-light of a Nevada December, Hank Mercer walked across 4 blocks of silent town to Silas Boggs's garage. The front door was unlocked. He pushed it open. The office was exactly as it had been the night before. Space heater in the corner, desk covered in invoices, coffee maker on the shelf. The keys to the gray sedan were hanging on the hook by the door exactly where Silas had said they would be. Silas Boggs was sitting at his desk. I was sitting very still. Hank understood before his mind had fully assembled what his eyes were seeing, the particular quality of that stillness. The way a human body occupies space differently when it will never occupy it any other way. He did not go further into the room. On the corner of the desk, placed with deliberate care weighted down by a coffee mug, was a single sheet of white paper. 8 words in block capital letters. Next time, it will not be a stranger. Hank stood in the doorway for 4 seconds. Then he turned and walked back to the motel. Nodding, walking because running attracts attention, and attention was the thing they could least afford. He knocked on Rose's door. 2 knocks. A pause. 2 more. She opened it almost immediately. She was dressed. She had her coat on and the canvas bag on her arm. She looked at his face and read it the way she read everything completely and in one pass. He said, we need to leave right now. She did not ask why. She stepped out and pulled the door closed behind her and said, all right. They walked back through the 4 blocks of quiet town. No lights on in the windows yet. The sky was still the deep purple of pre-dawn, not yet committed to anything. Their footsteps were the only sound on the street. Hank set the pace and Rose matched it without being asked, slightly faster than comfortable, not quite urgent. The right pace for people who need to be somewhere else and cannot afford to appear as though they need to be somewhere else. She did not look at him. She did not ask what he had seen in the garage. She walked with the canvas bag on her arm and her collar turned up against the cold, and her church shoes making their uneven sound on the pavement, and she kept up without complaint. At the second block, she said, the note on the desk. He said yes. She said they had time to write it, which means they were not in a hurry, which means they are not in a hurry about us either. He said they want us to come to them. They want us to feel the weight of it and make a mistake. She said, we are not going to make a mistake. He said no. They walked the last 2 blocks in silence. The gray sedan was in the second bay where Silas had said it would be. Hank took the keys from the hook and backed the car out, and Rose got in, and he drove them out the back of the lot onto the service road before the sun had made any commitment to the morning. He turned east first to see what followed, then south, then took the highway ramp north because north was not the direction they were going, and he needed the mirror for 2 minutes. The highway stayed empty behind them. He let out a breath and got them pointed toward Colorado. Rose sat with the canvas bag on her lap and her hands folded over it and watched the road. The red on her knuckles had gone pale before the heater caught up. She did not complain about the cold. He drove for 20 minutes before either of them spoke. She said he was already sitting there when they came. Silas, Hank glanced at her. She said they did not wait to see what he would decide. They made their point before he had the chance to make any decision at all. He said yes. She looked at her hands. She said that message was meant for us. He said yes. She was quiet for another mile. She said, I am sorry. Silas Boggs is dead because I walked into a diner in Fallon and asked a stranger for help. He said Silas Boggs is dead because Clifton Graves decided to send a message. That is the only person responsible for it. She looked out the window at the Nevada desert going gray and then brown as the light built slowly across the eastern sky. She said, that doesn't make it lighter. He said, no, it doesn't. He drove. The road ahead was straight and wet and empty and went on for a long way before it changed into anything. After 40 minutes, she said, Hank, the envelope. He said, what about it? She took it from the bag. She held it in her lap and turned it over in her hands. She said, Walter told me not to go past the papers until I was with Emmett. He was specific about that. He said the instructions were at the back of the last page. She said, we are not with Emmett, but I think we need to look now. She pulled the papers out carefully. She paged through them slowly, one page at a time. At the last page, she turned it over. She went still. Then she said it in the voice of a person who has been searching for something for a very long time and has just found it in the last place they would have thought to look. She said, he hid it here. He hid it in the envelope. I had it with me the whole time. He glanced over. She held the page up, taped flat to the back of it so flush against the paper that it would not shift or rattle or make itself known in any way was a small USB drive, dark gray, barely larger than a thumbnail. She said, 3 months, I had it with me the whole time. She said it without bitterness, with something that was closer to recognition. The tone of a woman who has been living alongside a man for 55 years, who was always operating several steps ahead, and who has just found one final proof of that and finds something like love in the recognition even now. He said, we need a computer. His phone buzzed. He handed it to Rose and she read the text from Kara Drummond aloud. An abandoned ranger station off Route 93. Forest Service had defunded it 6 years ago. A contact used the building for storage, a desktop computer inside. She sent the door code. He said, how far? Rose checked the map. She said, about 30 miles. He said, good. They drove. The ranger station turnoff was a gap in a wire fence marked by a weathered wooden sign half swallowed by scrub. The access road climbed half a mile before leveling at a flat clearing, a one-story building with faded green paint, a porch with a split rail, a hand-lettered sign that read Nevada DP of Forestry Eureka District and below it a year from a long time ago. Inside was one large room and a bathroom, plastic bins stacked along one wall, a folding table, 2 chairs, and on the table exactly as Kara had described a desktop computer old enough to have a disk drive and young enough to have USB ports. Hank powered it on, 2 minutes for it to fully wake. He plugged in the drive. A password window opened. Rose sat down in front of the screen and worked through it with the methodical patience of a woman who approaches problems from the beginning and does not skip steps. Walter's birthday, her birthday, the year they married, the year they bought the house, the name of the street where they had lived, their children's names, his mother's name, the college he had attended, the year he had started his career. Each one wrong. She sat back. She was not frustrated. She was thinking in the particular focused way of someone who knows the answer exists and is working backward to find it. He said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. She said, he would not have made it something I could guess quickly. That would defeat the purpose. But he would have made it something I would recognize the instant I came to it. Something that would feel unmistakably like him. She was quiet. Then she said, wait. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and brought out a letter folded in thirds. The paper had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases were soft as cloth. She opened it carefully on the table beside the keyboard and smoothed it flat with both palms. She looked at it. Her eyes moved across the first line. She said, do you remember Biscuit? He said, what? She said, the first line of this letter. Walter sent it 3 weeks before he died. Do you remember Biscuit? That was our dog. Our first year of marriage, 1969. A beagle. Walter named him. He said the name suited because Biscuit was the exact color of a biscuit and also because he was something warm you wanted to come home to after a hard day. She said it softly, not to Hank, exactly more to the room. To the memory of a man who had thought about what she would need when she reached this moment and had put it in the first line of a letter he sent her 3 weeks before he died, knowing she would carry the letter and knowing she would remember the dog. She looked at the keyboard. She typed the word, Biscuit. The screen unlocked. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Rose said very quietly, that impossible man. There was a silence in the ranger station that was different from the silence before. Something had entered the room and changed it. The drive held hundreds of files, documents, spreadsheets, scanned correspondence, photographs of pages taken in dim light by a careful man trying not to be noticed, held at odd angles, some of them blurred at the edges, all of them legible enough. 42 years of training on what mattered and what did not. Hank pulled his chair alongside hers. They went through it together. She read faster than he expected. 30 years of teaching had made reading the primary tool in everything she did. The summary spreadsheet loaded slowly on the old machine. When the numbers finally resolved on screen, Hank leaned in and looked at the total at the bottom of the last column. It was not $47 million. It was $247 million. Rose sat very still. He said 247 million. She said 12 years. 12 years. 7 different federal agencies. Dozens of shell companies spread across states whose incorporation laws ask the fewest questions. Money moving in carefully designed circles through layers of institutional distance. Contracts for services never delivered. Invoices for equipment that had never existed. Maintenance agreements for systems that had been shut down years before the payments began. And underneath all of it, connecting all of it, a small number of names appearing and reappearing across agencies and years, with the consistency of people who knew exactly where they stood and had no intention of ever moving. Clifton Graves was one of them. There were others, a deputy director at a defense procurement office whose signature appeared on approvals going back 9 years. A federal contracts attorney who had structured the shell companies from the beginning and knew exactly how they needed to look at every layer of scrutiny. A sitting United States senator who served on the Armed Services Committee and whose oversight responsibilities had apparently included for over a decade the active oversight of his own enrichment. Hank scrolled through the subsidiary company list slowly. Most of them were names designed to sound legitimate without being memorable. Meridian Solutions, Apex Technical Services, Clearwater Maintenance Group, names that lived in the comfortable middle distance of institutional credibility, bland enough to escape scrutiny from anyone not specifically looking for them. And then near the bottom of the third page, Carver Defense Supply, Dayton, Ohio. He stopped scrolling. He read it again. The company name, the location, the contract dates beginning in 2011, the amounts, the names of the officials who had authorized the payments. Carver Defense Supply, Dayton, Ohio. He had first heard that name in the fall of 2011 when his father called from the kitchen phone in the house on Ridgeline Drive and said in the careful voice of a man trying to stay calm, "Hank, I found something at work and I do not know what to do about it." He had heard it again in the registered mail his father sent him shortly after the copy Dale Mercer had mailed to his son because he was a man who understood that paper was harder to make disappear than a phone call. He had been carrying that name in his memory for 12 years, like a stone he could not put down, because putting it down would mean accepting that there was nowhere to put it. Carver Defense Supply, same name, same location, the company his father had found, the company his father had reported. The company whose officials had filed the counter-complaint that had helped accelerate the end of Dale Mercer's career and at a slower and more grinding pace, the end of Dale Mercer himself. The same company sitting in the middle of a $247 million fraud connected to Clifton Graves. Rose had been watching his face. She said, "What did you find?" He turned the screen toward her. He pointed to the entry. She read it. She looked at his face. She read it again. She said, "Is that?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The company your father reported." He said, "The one they fired him for finding." The complaint he filed that went nowhere. It went somewhere, it went to someone in this network. And they buried it, and Carver Defense Supply kept operating. And my father spent the last 2 years of his life believing he had just been unlucky, that he had stumbled into the wrong situation at the wrong time. He thought it was random bad luck. He died believing that. He said it was not random. On said it was these specific people with these names, their signatures are on these documents, and they cash these specific checks. And when my father found the edge of it, they removed him the way they removed every other obstacle, efficiently, without leaving anything visible. He stopped. The ranger station was completely quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub with a low, persistent sound. Rose said nothing for a long time. Then she said, Walter died trying to finish what your father started. She said it as a fact, not as comfort, not to make anything easier or neater, as a simple true thing. She said, and now you are here. He sat with that. He thought about Dale Mercer at his desk in Dayton. One line in one spreadsheet that did not add up. The decision that he could not move past it. The belief that the machinery of accountability was built to handle exactly this. He said, I have been angry at the wrong thing for 12 years. I was angry at the system, the whole faceless machinery of it. The kind of anger you can carry forever because there is nothing specific enough to put it down in front of. It felt like being angry at weather. He said, it was not the system, it was these people. With these names, making specific decisions and cashing specific checks. She said yes. He looked at the screen. The names and the numbers and the 12 years of it spread across hundreds of carefully assembled files. He said, we send all of this now, 3 copies, before we move from here. He opened the email client on the old machine. The connection was slow, but it held. He attached everything, every file, the summary, the supporting documents, the scanned correspondence, all of it. He sent it to Kara Drummond at the Denver Courier, then to an address Rose gave him for Judge Emmett Treadwell in Denver. Then he created a free email account under a name that meant nothing and sent a 3rd copy to it and wrote the login credentials on the inside cover of a paperback from one of the storage bins and put the book in Rose's bag. 3 copies, 3 separate destinations. None of them connected to each other. Kara responded in 11 minutes. She wrote, this is real. I have seen enough to know. I am calling my sister. He wrote back, who is your sister? She wrote Beth Slater, FBI Field Office, Denver. We have different last names. Our parents divorced when we were 7. I stayed with our mother. She went with our father. She has been building a case on Graves for 14 months. She has the pattern and the suspicion. She has been missing the evidence to act on it until now. He wrote, how quickly can she move when she has this? Kara wrote, tell her when and where. She will be there. He wrote, Denver tonight. Judge Emmett Treadwell, West Side. I will send the address when we are an hour out. She wrote, we will be ready. He closed the application and unplugged the drive and gave it to Rose. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat. Not the bag, the coat. Closer to her than anything. His phone buzzed, a text from Dex Crane. No call, just a text, and attached to it a photograph. The photograph showed a bar interior at night, dim lighting, a corner table, 2 men. One was Dex, unmistakable by the set of his shoulders and the way he held a glass. The other was younger, mid-30s, the build and posture of someone who had been military and gone private sector afterward. Leaning forward, talking with his hands on the table in the way of a man who is making a point he wants to be sure lands. Below the photograph, Dex had written, they found my daughter's school yesterday. Sent me a photograph of her at recess taken from outside the fence. She did not know anyone was there. I gave them Eureka. I told them about Silas. I am sorry, Hank. I am sorry about the mechanic. I would not have done it for money. You know that. Hank set the phone down on the table. He sat with it for a moment. Rose had read it over his shoulder. She said, was he someone you trusted? He said, someone I trusted enough to call. I do not have many of those. She said, his daughter. He said, 9 years old. They sent him a photograph of her taken through the school fence at recess without her knowing anyone was watching. That is how they work. They find the one thing that will move a person and they use it. It is not personal. It is efficient. She said, are you angry at him? He thought about that honestly, the way the question deserved. He said no, a man with a 9-year-old daughter and a photograph of her taken through a fence at school. No, I am not angry at Dex Crane. He picked up the phone and typed back. He wrote, I know about the photograph. Move your daughter somewhere they do not have on record. Today, stay off your regular phone. I am not coming back at you for this. He sent it and put the phone in his jacket. They left the ranger station and drove back to the highway. 40 minutes into the drive, he saw the lights ahead. Red and blue, a patrol vehicle across the right lane. An officer standing beside it. He said, watch the officer, his hand specifically. Rose watched. The officer stood with his hands near his sides, right hand close to his belt, but not on it. He was not moving toward the approaching car. He was standing still with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to someone waiting rather than someone directing. He said, a real checkpoint. The officer moves toward you. He wants to be the authority in the situation. He makes himself the center of it. He said that man does not want to be the authority. He wants us stopped. He checked the mirror, nothing behind them yet. He said, hold on. He swung right off the highway onto a service road, a gap in a wire fence with 2 tracks worn into the soil. The sedan bounced hard across rough ground. Rose grabbed the door handle and held on and said nothing. He pushed the speed despite the terrain because rough ground he could manage, and men with radios he could not. The service road ran along the base of a ridge and opened at an old mining property. A fence, low metal buildings, rusted equipment, half buried in the earth. He drove through a second gap in the fence on the far side and found a parallel dirt track heading east. Behind them at the highway, a second set of lights appeared, a dark vehicle, no markings. Pulling onto the service road, he drove. He pushed the sedan as hard as he was willing to push it on dirt, and it gave him what he asked for. 3 miles out, he found pavement running north and took it and put distance between them and the lights until there was nothing in the mirror. Then the engine changed. A change in it sounded, a hesitation, a shudder through the frame. He pulled to the shoulder before it got worse, and when he cut the engine, smoke curled from under the hood, and the smell of hot metal came with it. He got out and opened the hood. Something had taken damage on the rough ground, coolant on the pavement. Rose got out and came around and stood beside him. She looked at the smoke. She looked at the road in both directions, empty and flat, and going to nothing in both directions. She said, how far to a main road? He said, about 3 miles. She looked at her shoes. She looked at him. She said, I have walked further for less reason. They walked. The road was a county road, 2 lanes, no shoulder worth mentioning. The pavement was cracked and patched in the irregular pattern of roads that get repaired when the budget allows and not before. On both sides, scrubland, sage and rabbit brush, and the occasional clump of juniper standing low against the sky. The kind of country that does not offer anything unnecessary, including comfort. She did not slow down. He could see by the set of her jaw after the first mile that the shoes were costing her something she would not name, because naming it would not change anything about it. The heels were wrong for this surface. Too narrow. Every step on the uneven pavement required a small correction that added up over distance into something real. He matched her pace without commenting on it. After the first mile, she said, Walter used to say that the most useful thing a person can do in a bad situation is to keep moving and keep thinking at the same time. He said most people can do one or the other, but not both. He said, which one fails first? She said, the thinking usually. People keep moving out of instinct, but the thinking gets loud and circular and stops being useful. He said in Walter. She said Walter could do both, even at the end, even when he knew something was wrong and did not know yet how wrong. He kept moving and he kept thinking and he kept building the case. She paused to navigate a section where the pavement edge had crumbled into the dirt. She said, I used to find it frustrating. When the children were small, he would be so calm and methodical about everything, and I would want him to react the way normal people react with some noise and some feeling in it. But I came to understand that it was not coldness. It was how he protected the people around him. If he panicked, we would panic. So he did not panic. He said, your children are not here. She said, no, I did not call them. I did not want them involved in this until there was something solid enough to involve them in. Something that could not be taken away. She said, now there is something solid. He offered his arm after the second mile, and she took it without making it into anything more than two people walking on a cold Nevada night, one of them helping the other across rough pavement without it needing to be more than that. The temperature dropped as the last light left the sky the way it drops in high desert when the sun has gone 10 degrees in 20 minutes without warning. He could feel it through his jacket. Rose turned her collar up and kept walking. She had the kind of endurance that comes not from physical condition, but from deciding in advance that you will finish what you have started and meaning it. They reached the highway as dark came fully down and the stars came out in force above them. The high desert sky doing what it does on a clear December night, which is to make you understand how much of the universe is overhead at all times and how little of it is paying attention to you specifically. I was about to reach for his phone when he heard it. A diesel engine. The sound of something large and heavy decelerating for the long curve in the road ahead. He turned. A semi coming south, running lights orange in the early dark, slowing as the driver took in two figures on the shoulder of an empty highway with no vehicle behind them. He stepped to the edge of the pavement and raised one hand. Air brakes. The long, careful deceleration of a very heavy load being persuaded to stop. The truck pulled over 50 yards past them and the driver's window came down. The man behind the wheel was 63 maybe, skin weathered from altitude and years of sun through a windshield. Gray at the temples, canvas jacket with the collar turned up against the cold coming in the window. He looked at Hank. He looked at Rose. He looked at the direction they had come from, the dark, empty road with no car on it. He did not ask what had happened. He said Denver. Hank said yes. He said throw your bags in the back. His name was Grady Wills. The cab was warm and smelled of coffee and road hours, and there was country music low on the radio. Something old with a steel guitar that belonged to this stretch of highway, the way certain sounds belong to certain places. He offered his thermos, and Hank passed it to Rose first, and she drank and handed it back without ceremony. And Grady drove north without asking any of the questions a man in his position could have reasonably asked. How was the kind of man who understood that some questions are invitations to trouble, and he had driven long enough to know that the highway at night produces unusual combinations of people and circumstances, and that most of them were none of his business, and all of them needed the same thing, which was to get from where they were to somewhere else. After 20 minutes, he said, without looking away from the road, "You both all right?" Hank said, "We will be." Grady nodded as though this was a complete and satisfactory answer, which to a man like him, it was. He adjusted the radio down another notch and drove. Rose fell asleep against the window within the hour. The warmth and the motion and the accumulated weight of 4 days of running and 3 months of carrying is something too heavy. She went out completely the way people sleep when they have been running on borrowed time and have finally found something close enough to safety that the body takes what it needs without asking permission. Grady glanced at her once in the mirror. Then he looked at Hank. He said she'd do okay walking those miles. Hank said she did fine. Grady said tough woman. Hank said yes. Grady drove. Hank watched the dark country on both sides of the road and said nothing more, and Grady seemed to understand, in the way of a man who has driven many hours alone for many years, that nothing right now was exactly the right thing to offer, and he offered it without making anything of it. An hour outside Denver, Hank's phone buzzed. He read the message from Kara Drummond. Story verified. Editor has reviewed the documentation. Ready to publish on her word. She is holding until morning. Then the next line. But Hank, Graves knows you are going to Treadwell. Someone has been watching Treadwell's street for 2 days. He is not waiting for you to make the first move anymore. He looked at that for a long moment. He looked at Rose asleep against the window. The white hair, the canvas bag still on her lap even in sleep. The church shoes that had walked 3 miles on a Nevada highway without complaint. He thought about Silas Boggs. He thought about the 8 words on the white paper. I thought about what it meant that Clifton Graves was watching a street in Denver rather than moving directly on Rose. It meant he still did not know for certain whether copies had been made and where they had gone. He was waiting to see what Rose did before he closed the door. He was a man who had learned to let things come to him rather than reaching. That window would not stay open much longer. Rose opened her eyes. She came back from sleep quickly, like someone who had been sleeping lightly out of necessity rather than fully out. She looked at him. He held up the phone and she read Kara's message. She read it twice. She handed the phone back. She looked out the windshield at the lights of the Denver Metro beginning to gather on the horizon ahead, that amber glow that cities throw up into the dark sky visible from a long way away. She said, then we stop running. She said it quietly. To the road. To the glow ahead. She looked at him. She said, we stop running and we start choosing. Grady Wills let them out on a commercial street 8 blocks from Treadwell's neighborhood. He pulled to the curb and Rose climbed down carefully, and Hank came around, and by the time he looked up, Grady was already back in traffic, running lights going north and receding fast. A man who had driven 2 people from a Nevada highway to Denver because they needed it and had asked for nothing and would remember nothing in particular. They walked. The neighborhood was modest in the permanent way of places that had always been modest and had made their peace with that fact before anyone alive could remember. Brick houses, mature trees, orange sodium streetlights throwing long shadows across sidewalks that had been poured before most of the people on the street were born. The specific quiet of a neighborhood that goes to bed at 10 and has always gone to bed at 10 and intends to continue doing so. Hank walked 1 block past Treadwell Street before turning down it. He wanted to see the street before it knew he was on it. He walked at the pace of a man with nowhere urgent to be, looking at the parked cars on both sides. It's a seat in 2 houses down from Treadwell's that had been there a while. He could tell by the condensation pattern on the glass. Someone had been sitting in it with the engine off and the heat running intermittently for at least 2 hours. The glass was not uniformly fogged the way glass fogs when a car has simply been cold all evening. There were warm patches and cold patches in the condensation, and that pattern told a story. He walked past without changing pace. They came to Treadwell's house from the south, using the shadow of a large oak in the neighboring yard for the last 20 feet. Hank knocked twice on the back door. A pause. 2 more. A porch light came on. The door opened. Emmett Treadwell was 82 years old and looked like a man who had decided a long time ago not to be defined by what was happening to his body. He was thin in the way of the seriously ill something essential being quietly and steadily recalled by the disease. His face was sharp and pale, and his eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, were the most steadfast eyes Hank had looked into in a long time. The eyes of someone who had been looking at hard things for decades and had not looked away. Ian wore a gray cardigan and slippers and held the door with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 40 years on a federal bench and had never fully stopped carrying the posture of it. He looked at Rose first. He said, Rose, come inside, both of you, right now. The house was warm and full of books, every flat surface occupied by them. Stacks on the floor, or shelves on every wall in the front room, floor-to-ceiling books organized by a system only their owner fully understood. A fire had been burning earlier, and the coals were still orange. On the coffee table in front of the sofa, arranged in careful order, were printed pages. He had been reading the files they had sent him. By the look of the empty coffee cups and the notepad dense with his precise handwriting, he had been at it for several hours and had not stopped until they arrived. He poured Rose tea without asking and brought it to her, and she took it in both hands, and he watched the warmth reach her visibly, something in her shoulders releasing. Treadwell sat in the wingback chair across from the sofa. He looked at the papers on the table for a moment. Then he looked at Hank. He said, I have been a federal judge for 22 years. I have seen corruption cases. I have presided over some of them. I know what the documentation for these things needs to say and how it needs to be organized to mean something in a courtroom. He paused. He said, I have never in my professional life seen anything that looks like this. He said, $247 million, 7 agencies, 12 years. The architecture of this network required professional legal guidance to construct. Someone who understood exactly where the oversight gaps existed and built this structure specifically to fit those gaps. This did not happen by accident or incompetence. This was designed. He said, this afternoon I spent 3 hours making calls. 6 people, all of them I have known for 20 or 30 years and whose integrity I would put my own name behind without hesitation. Inspector General contacts a Senate staffer on the Oversight Committee who has been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence for 2 years. a retired federal prosecutor who now consults for a congressional investigative office. He said all 6 of them have seen enough of what you sent to understand that what is coming is real and substantial. They will be ready to move the moment this story becomes public. He said the story has to go first. That is the trigger for everything else. Rose said she is ready. We told her 2 hours. Treadwell nodded, then he looked at Hank directly. He said there is a car 2 houses north of here that has not moved since this afternoon. I noticed it when I came back from my walk at 3 o'clock. Hank said I saw it on the way in. Treadwell said, then he already knows you are here. Hank said he has known since at least last night. He has not moved on you directly because he does not know for certain whether copies of the documentation exist and where they went. He is waiting to see what we do before he closes the door. He said Hi is going to stop waiting, tonight maybe. Rose set down her teacup. She said, I want to call him. Both men looked at her. She said, Clifton Graves. I want to call him myself, Hank said. Rose. She said, he is coming regardless. You just said it. He knows we are here and he is going to wait for what he thinks is the right moment and come. But we have people from the FBI moving into position. We have a journalist ready to publish. We have everything we need already in motion. She said, if I call him now and tell him I am tired and frightened and I want this to be finished, he will come now on our schedule. He will come believing he is walking into a surrender. She said he will walk into what we have already built. Treadwell looked at Hank. Hank looked at Rose. She was sitting upright on the sofa in her church shoes with the canvas bag on her lap and her hands folded over it. She was 85 years old and she had been running for 4 days and she had not slept properly in 3 months. And she was wearing the same coat she had worn when she walked into a diner in Fallon, Nevada and asked a stranger to pretend to be her grandson. She was also the most resolved person in the room by a considerable margin. He said, you are sure? She said, Walter spent 40 years doing his job carefully and correctly and by the rules. He found all of this and he tried to handle it the right way and he died before he could finish it. I have spent 3 months looking for what he left me. 4 days being chased across Nevada. I am not going to spend 1 more minute waiting for Clifton Graves to choose the moment. She said, I want to choose it. Hank reached into his jacket pocket and opened the tracking application on his phone. He had not opened it since the diner in Fallon. The screen loaded and showed a small marker on a map. The marker was moving. It was on I-70 westbound, approximately 12 miles from where they were sitting. He turned the phone so Rose could see it. She looked at the moving dot. She looked at Hank. She said, he is already on his way. He said, yes. She said, then we do it now. He sent a text to Kara Drummond, the address in 2 words. Kara responded in 40 seconds. She wrote, Beth is positioned 4 blocks east with 14 agents. Tell her when to move. He looked at Treadwell. Treadwell said, go to the backyard, the gate to the alley. There is a shed in the back left corner. Take Mrs. Calloway there and wait. I will remain here in this chair. Rose said, Emmett. He said, I am not going to hide in a shed, Rose. I am going to sit in my chair, and if they come through this door, I will look them in the eye. I have been looking at people who intended to frighten me in courtrooms for 40 years, and not one of them has ever made me move from where I intended to stand. He said, go, both of you. They went through this kitchen and out the back door. The yard was small and well-maintained, a dormant garden along one fence, and an old maple tree that had dropped all its leaves. The shed in the back left corner, exactly where Treadwell had said it would be. They went inside, garden tools on hooks along one wall, a folded tarp on a shelf, the smell of old soil and motor oil and winter cold. Rose stood with her back against the shed wall. Hank stood at the door, leaving it open 1 inch, watching the yard and the alley gate beyond it. 12 minutes passed, then Rose's phone rang. She looked at the number. She looked at Hank. He nodded once. She answered. Her voice changed, not a performance and not a lie. A truthful adjustment, all the exhaustion and fear that was genuinely real, brought to the surface where it could be heard plainly. The voice of an 85-year-old woman who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and was finally genuinely approaching the limit of what she could carry alone. She said, Mr. Graves, yes, I know you have been looking for me. She said, I am at Judge Treadwell's house, Birchwood Street, the white brick with the green shutters. She said, I am very tired. I have the drive. I have not sent anything to anyone. I just want this to be finished. She listened. She said, yes. Come now. Let us end this tonight. She ended the call. She looked at Hank. She said 20 minutes. He sent the signal to Kara. She responded in seconds. Beth moving to final position. 12 minutes. They waited. The night was cold and clear and completely still. Every sound carried farther than it should in the cold, high air. Somewhere 2 streets over, a dog barked twice and stopped. A car passed on the main road, and the sound of it reached them cleanly and faded. The maple tree in the yard moved slightly in a wind they could not feel at ground level. He heard them before he saw them. A gate latch, deliberate and controlled, operated by someone who knows how to move quietly and is choosing to. Then footsteps, multiple sets, the disciplined spacing of people who move as a unit and have done it many times. 4 men came through the back gate. Clifton Graves came last. I was dressed in dark clothing, nothing like the gray suit from the diner, and he moved with an ease that confirmed what Hank had suspected since the first night. Whatever Graves had been before he became a Washington consultant, it had involved moving through dark places with people who were trained for it. He was comfortable in this. He had done it before. He was also wearing the jacket with the pen in the inside pocket. The 4 men spread out across the yard with the efficiency of a rehearsed pattern. One to each. Graves in the center. He looked at the house. He looked at the shed. He said, Mrs. Calloway, I know you are there. Please come out. Rose looked at Hank. He nodded once. She opened the shed door and walked out. She walked to the center of the yard and stopped and looked at Clifton Graves with the steady and specific attention of a woman who has been reading people accurately for 85 years and has no intention of misreading this one. He said, where is the drive? She said, my coat pocket. He said, give it to me and this ends tonight. No more running, no more fear. You go home and you grieve your husband properly and you live whatever time you have left in peace. I have no interest in harming an 85-year-old woman. Surely you understand that. She said, I understand a great deal, Mr. Graves. She said, I understand that my husband found what you have been doing, that he spent 6 months of the last year of his life documenting it with the same care he brought to every task across 42 years of public service, because he was a thorough man who believed that evidence was the only argument that could not be taken away from you. I understand that he tried to handle this correctly, through the proper channels, to the right people, and that someone closed every channel he opened. She said, I understand that he died without finishing it. Graves said, Mrs. Calloway. She said, I am not finished. She said, I understand that you had him killed. I do not have legal proof of that tonight, but I know it the way I know the difference between a spring morning and a winter one. My husband ran 2 miles every morning. He had blood work that his doctor called remarkable for a man his age. He did not have a heart attack. He had an appointment with Judge Treadwell that someone did not want him to keep. Graves was quiet for a moment, looking at her, and said, your husband suffered a coronary event. I am genuinely sorry for your loss. She said, you are going to say that here in front of all of these people. She said, then let me say something in front of all of these people. She said, you have been doing this for 12 years, $247 million, 7 federal agencies, dozens of contracts for work that was never done paid for by the people of this country who trusted that the men managing these contracts were doing their jobs. You built it carefully and you protected it carefully, and when my husband found it, you removed him the way you remove any obstacle, quietly, in a way that would not attract attention, in a way that would look like nothing at all. She said, but Walter was more careful than you knew, and I am more stubborn than you expected. Graves looked at her for a long moment. The pleasantness he had shown in the diner was entirely gone. What was underneath it was the cold assessment of a man who has been in control of a situation for a long time and is beginning to understand that the situation has changed. He looked at Hank. He said, where is the drive? Hank said, which copy? Something shifted in Graves's face. A very small change, the kind that happens when a man realizes the situation he thought he understood is not the situation he is actually in. He said, you are bluffing. Hank said it went to 3 places 6 hours ago. A reporter at the Denver Courier. Judge Treadwell, who spent this afternoon reaching out to 6 people whose names you will recognize and who are ready to move the moment the story goes public. And a third address you will never find. The story publishes at 6 in the morning, whether or not anyone in this yard is alive to see it. Graves said, even if the story runs, you are two people without credibility against men with 40 years of public service and the resources to define what this narrative looks like. Do you understand how these things actually go when they go to a fight? Rose said, I understand that evidence does not require credibility. Evidence speaks for itself. What my husband put on that drive is not our word against yours. It is routing numbers, contract records, bank statements, 12 years of your signatures on documents describing services that were never performed. It is a paper trail that leads at every junction back to you. She said, you cannot argue with a routing number, Mr. Graves. You can only explain it, and then the lights came on. From 3 directions simultaneously. Vehicle lights from the alley behind the gate, lights from the neighboring yards on both sides. A powerful beam from above the roof line, steady and absolute in covering everything. With the lights came the sound of engines and the organized movement of many people, and a woman's voice through a loudspeaker, calm and clear. FBI, do not move. Keep your hands where they can be seen. The 4 men at the corners of the yard did not resist. They were professionals, and they understood immediately what the lights meant and what resistance would cost them. They raised their hands with the resigned efficiency of people who have run the calculation and accepted the result. Graves stood in the center of the yard. He did not raise his hands immediately. He looked at the lights coming from 3 directions. He looked at the gate where agents in tactical gear were coming through single file. He looked at Hank. He said, the pen. Hank said, you left it on the table. I put it back. Something crossed Graves's face. The expression of a man who has been in control of a situation for a very long time and is understanding at this specific moment that he has not been in control of this one, that he never was. He raised his hands. Agent Beth Slater came through the gate last. She was 41 years old and had her sister's eyes and none of her sister's patience for anything that was not the immediate task in front of her. She wore a vest and a sidearm, and she moved through the yard, assessing all of it, simultaneously taking in the positions of the 4 men and Graves and Rose and Hank and Treadwell, visible now on the back porch, all of it cataloged in the first few seconds. She walked to the center of the yard. She looked at Rose first. She said, Mrs. Calloway, I am Agent Slater. My sister told me what you did to get here. I want you to understand that the documentation you provided has been reviewed by my team, and it is more than sufficient for immediate arrest and for the beginning of a very significant federal investigation. She paused. She said, you built this. What happened in this yard tonight is because of what you did. Rose looked at her, then she looked at Hank. I gave her the smallest nod he had. She said to Beth Slater, I had help. Beth Slater looked at Hank. She said, my sister speaks well of you. He said, your sister has good judgment. She turned to her team and gave instructions with the economy of a person for whom every word is a tool selected for a specific purpose, and no tool is ever wasted. Graves and the 4 men were separated and moved through the gate in pairs. Graves walked with his hands behind his back and his chin level and said nothing to anyone. He was already in his own mind having a conversation with attorneys, which was the only conversation he intended to have from this point forward. When they were gone, the yard was quiet. The lights from the neighboring properties switched off. Treadwell had come to the back door at some point during it all and was standing on the porch in his gray cardigan watching. Beth Slater came back to Hank. She said, there is a name in the documentation, a closed complaint from 2011. Dale Mercer, Dayton, Ohio, quality control technician at a defense contractor, filed a complaint about defective components in a supply chain. The complaint was formally closed 6 weeks after it was filed. Closure was authorized by someone in a chain of command that traces back to Graves's network. She said, is that your father? He said, yes. She looked at him steadily, not with pity, with the straight attention of someone who understands the specific weight of what a piece of information like that costs the person receiving it. She said, we will reopen that investigation as part of this case. Formally, his name will be in the official record. The complaint he filed will be part of the evidence chain. What he found in 2011 will be part of what puts these people in a federal courtroom. Hank looked out at the yard, the frost forming on the grass, the old maple, the orange wash of Denver's light on the clouds above. He said he would have hated that. She said, what do you mean? He said, the attention, being in the newspaper, his name in a record. He was a private man. He thought doing your job correctly was its own justification and did not require an audience to make it mean something. She said most honest men feel that way. He said yes, they do. She said, I am sorry about your father, Mr. Mercer. He said thank you. She went back to her team. Hank stood alone in the yard for a while. 12 years had a specific weight. He had been carrying it in a specific place between the chest and the left shoulder, the place where things reside when they are not grief exactly and not anger exactly, but something that exists between those two things and does not have a name most people ever need. That weight was still there, but for the first time in 12 years, it was resting differently, not lighter, changed in its character somehow as though whatever it was made of had shifted its composition, slightly had become something he could turn toward the light and examine from more than one angle, rather than something he was required to carry only in the dark where it could not be seen. Rose came and stood beside him. She did not speak immediately. She stood in the cold yard in her church shoes and her rumpled coat and looked at the same darkness he was looking at. The alley and the fence and the city beyond it, all of it quiet now. Then she put her hand on his arm. Her hand was small and the knuckles were still red from the cold, and it rested on his arm with a weight that had nothing to do with its size and everything to do with one person choosing to stand beside another. She said, you should go find somewhere quiet. You have been carrying this for a long time. He said, what about you? She said, I have 42 years of Walter's filing system to go through. Every drawer, every shelf, every book he ever put on a shelf. I am going to find things I did not know about him and things I knew better than anyone, and I am going to cry, and I am going to laugh, and I am going to be exactly where I want to be. She paused. She said, that is not nothing, Hank. After everything, to know exactly where you want to be. He looked at her, the white hair and the church shoes and the coat that had been through everything she had been through and had held up as well as she had. She said, go. He picked up his jacket from where it had landed on the garden fence at some point during the night. He went through the house and shook Treadwell's hand at the back door, without either of them needing to say anything, and stepped out into the Denver night. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Rose Calloway was sitting at Emmett Treadwell's kitchen table with a cup of tea when the link arrived from Kara Drummond. She opened it. The Denver Courier. The story was live. She read it the way she had always read important things from the beginning and carefully, not skipping ahead to the end. The story was long and thorough, and Kara Drummond had written it with the precision of someone who understood that the facts themselves were sufficient and required nothing added to make them more than they already were. Halfway through the second page, Rose set the phone flat on the table. Outside, the first light was coming over the Rockies. The sky above the mountains was going from black to the deep blue that comes just before color returns to the world, that specific moment before dawn, when everything is still the color of potential. She sat and looked at it, then she picked up the phone and read to the end. Near the bottom of the piece, in a paragraph about the history of the network and how it had been able to operate for as long as it had without exposure, there was a sentence. The pattern first came to light internally in 2011 when a quality control technician named Dale Mercer filed a complaint about Carver Defense Supply, a subsidiary company in the network. The complaint was improperly closed. Mercer died in 2013 without seeing his findings acted upon. Then the sentence that followed it. But Walter Calloway, who died in September of this year, spent the final months of his life completing what Mercer had begun. Rose read those two sentences again. She set the phone down. She folded her hands on the table and looked at the window and the growing light beyond it that was stronger now, turning the mountains from dark shapes into something with color and depth and detail. She thought about Walter at his desk in the study on those long, late evenings, the lamp on after she had gone to bed, the careful handwriting on the notepads she had found afterward with their precise columns of names and numbers and dates. She thought about the night he had stood in the kitchen doorway with that look on his face and said, everything is going to change. She thought about the morning she had come downstairs and the coffee was cold in the pot and he was not there. She thought about a man she had never met who had sat at a desk in Dayton, Ohio in 2011 and found one wrong number in a spreadsheet and decided because of the kind of man he was that he could not simply move past it. She thought about his son in a diner in Fallon, Nevada, drinking cold coffee with nowhere to be. She picked up the phone and opened a new message to the number Hank had given her. She wrote, "The story is live. Walter's name is in it. So is your father's. Kara made certain of it. I thought you should know before you read it somewhere cold." She set the phone down. She wrapped both hands around the teacup. She sat in the growing light of an early Colorado morning, and she thought about all the years and all the people and all the quiet, careful work that brings a true thing into the world and keeps it there. The patience it requires and the cost it carries and the way it moves through time in ways no one who does it ever gets to fully see. The Denver bus station was 4 blocks from Treadwell's house. Hank had noted it on his way out of the neighborhood the night before automatically, and without deciding to the way certain habits do not wait for a decision before operating. He bought a ticket to Salt Lake City because it was the next bus heading west, and west felt like the right direction. He sat in the waiting area and watched the other passengers. The family at one end with 2 children asleep across the plastic seats, their parents drinking coffee from paper cups, and not talking to people who had been awake longer than they had planned and were waiting it out together. An old man with a duffel bag reading a paperback with a spine so cracked you could not read the title from a few seats away. A teenager with headphones who had been there long enough that the chair had begun to shape itself to him. He sat with his jacket on his lap and watched the station do what stations do at this hour, which is to gather people who are going from one version of their life to another and hold them briefly in the particular suspended state of transit, neither here nor there, belonging temporarily to the road between things rather than to any specific place. His phone buzzed at 6:12. He read the message from Rose. He read it again. He held the phone in both hands in the warm light of the bus station. Around him, the ordinary sounds of the early morning continued without pause. The announcements and the rolling of luggage across the floor and the low conversations of people going from one place to another and not thinking much about it. He thought about what she had written. Walter's name in it. So is your father's. Kara made certain of it. I thought about Kara Drummond sitting at a desk somewhere in Denver in the small hours of the morning typing those sentences, deciding to put them in, making certain they were in. A journalist who had never met Dale Mercer and never would, doing the specific and careful work of making sure a name did not get left out of a story it belonged in. I thought about his father. Not the end of it, not the phone call, and the instruction, and the guilt of having followed it. He thought about the beginning. A winter morning in Dayton, Dale Mercer sitting down at his desk in the building on Riverside Road and opening the spreadsheet the way he opened a spreadsheet every morning, which was methodically and without drama, because that was how he did everything. Finding in one line among thousands something that did not add up. A number that was wrong in a way that was not accidental. A man who could have moved to the next line, who could have closed the file and made his coffee and gone home that evening, and watched the news and said nothing to anyone, and kept his job and his health and the years he had left, who had every practical reason to look away and no practical reason whatsoever not to, who had looked at the number and had not looked away. I thought about that decision. He had been thinking about it for 12 years, and this was the first time it had sat still long enough to look at clearly. The decision had cost Dale Mercer everything. It had cost him his career and his health and eventually his life, and it had not in the end stopped anything. Carver Defense Supply had kept operating for 12 more years. The money had kept moving. The people responsible had kept their positions and their reputations and their comfortable lives. Until now, until a 78-year-old auditor in rural Nevada had picked up the same thread from a different end and had pulled it for 6 months and had died before he could finish what he started. Until an 85-year-old woman in church shoes had walked into a diner in Fallon, Nevada on a rainy night in December and asked a stranger to pretend to be her grandson. He deleted the message. He put the phone in his jacket. He got on the bus and found a window seat near the back and put his jacket on the empty seat beside him. They were an hour west of Denver, moving through the canyon country where the Colorado River cuts through the rock when the light came fully up. The canyon walls went from black to dark red to the deep burnt orange that only exists in the American West at first light, the color of something very old being briefly and completely seen by the sun before the day moves on. On the seat across the aisle, someone had left a newspaper, the Denver Courier Morning Edition. He could see it from where he sat without picking it up. He read the headline once. Then he looked back out the window. The river appeared below the highway, gray and running fast, with the winter runoff cutting through the canyon floor, the way it had been cutting through it for longer than any human record, indifferent to all of it, and persistent in ways that nothing built by people ever manages to be. The bus followed the highway, and the highway followed the river, and the light kept coming slow and certain, turning everything it touched the color of something that had been waiting a long time to be seen. He watched the canyon walls go by. I thought about all of it. Fallon, Nevada, a diner in the rain, an old woman in church shoes asking a stranger to pretend to be her grandson. Silas Boggs at his desk, a sheet of paper with 8 words on it. A ranger station in the high desert, and a dog named Biscuit, and a password that was also a love letter to the first year of a marriage. $247 million in 12 years, in the names of men who had believed they were beyond the reach of what one careful 78-year-old man had spent 6 months quietly assembling in the study of a house in rural Nevada. I thought about Dale Mercer's name in a newspaper in the official record, connected finally and permanently to the true thing he had found and reported and paid for with his career and with his life. There had been no ceremony in it, no moment where the world stopped and acknowledged the cost and settled the account. That was not how it worked. It never had been, and it never would be. But the name was there, in the record, permanent, connected to the truth, alongside Walter Calloway's. 2 men who had each found a piece of the same true thing at different times, in different places, and had each decided because of who they were that they could not pass it by. That mattered. It did not return what had been taken. It did not undo what had been done. But it mattered in the way that true things matter, which is quietly and without theater, and in a way that does not require an audience and does not fade with time. The canyon widened ahead. The river curved south and disappeared around a bend. The walls fell back, and the land opened up the way it opens after you have been in the narrow places long enough suddenly, and with a sense of room that feels like something being restored to you. Something you had not entirely realized you were missing until it came back. The bus moved west through it. The light came fully over the Rockies behind them and reached across the open country ahead, and the whole of it went orange and gold in the early morning, the color of a December day in the American West, finally committing fully to itself without reservation. Hank Mercer sat with his hands loose in his lap and watched the country open, and he did not look away.